Okay, just real quickly, how many of you heard Laurel? Would you go ahead and raise your hands? Now, how many of you heard Yanni? You guys are the spiritual ones right there, just in case you were wondering. Hey, just real quick, guys, would you help me welcome everybody who's sitting in the cafe and also everybody who's watching this on Facebook Live. Thank you guys so much for joining us. You know what? This is what I think. I think heroes play a very important role in our lives. You're probably in very good company if you consider your own father your hero. For me, my dad is definitely my hero because I can't even imagine what it would be like as an adult to go to another country where I don't know the culture, where I don't know the language. This is what my parents always say, that they came to the United States from Korea with 2 bags, 2 kids, $2,000. I mean, we go to Legoland with more, you know, and they moved to another country with 2 bags, 2 kids, $2,000. My dad didn't know the language. In fact, when he first came to this country, he didn't have a job. He wasn't able to get a job. And because he could not provide for his family in the beginning, my parents and my sisters, without me, I was just a twinkle in my parents' eye at that point. My family, they lived in a condemned, half burned out apartment. My dad stood in the welfare line for half a day before all of a sudden he got out of line. He called up my mom with a quarter in the little payphone machine. Remember those things? And then all of a sudden he said, honey, we did not come to this country in order to be beggars. And so from that point on, my dad held down a technician job at General Electric during the day. He worked as a cashier at night, where he was held up 4 times in 1 month, by the way. He worked as a painter on the weekends, all in order to provide for his family. And even through they've been here for almost 50 years now. Even through all of those trials and tribulations, here's what my father tells me, Mark, don't ever complain about paying taxes because this country has afforded us the opportunity to live the American dream. Like that, like my dad is my hero. I want you guys to see something right here. Here's a picture of the Battle of Dunkirk. If you don't know much about the Battle of Dunkirk, almost the entire British Army, over 300,000 soldiers are stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, France, where German Luftwaffe planes are strafing them like sitting ducks. Now, the British government is so apologetic, entirely apologetic about the fact that they cannot send military vessels to go and save their soldiers. And so they have to telegraph their own soldiers, telling them that they're sending what? That they're sending fishing boats. Recreational boats to go and save them. And while the British government is expecting nothing but a desperate and disparaging reply in response, do you know what they get back? They get telegraphed back 3 words. You know what those 3 words were? But even if. Do you know where those words come from? Those words come from the Bible. In the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are standing before King Nebuchadnezzar, like 3 different William Wallaces standing before Nebuchadnezzar, and they say this, but even if our God does not come and save us, we will not bow down to your image of gold. You know what those British soldiers were saying? They were essentially saying this, but even if we must shed our blood on foreign soil, that even if we have to give our lives, that even if our God does not come and save us, that we will not bow down to the Nazi regime, that we will not bow down to their fascist ideals. There's something about heroes that inspire us to live a different kind of life, that cause us, that beckon us to soar above the level of mediocrity. Peter Gibbons says this in his work called A Call to Heroism. He says this, that I cannot imagine a world without heroes, a world without genius and nobility, a world without exalted enterprise, high purpose, and transcendent courage, a world without risk and suffering. A world like that would be nothing but gray and flat and dull, for who would show us the way and who would inspire us to greatness? Now today, what I want to do is I want to talk about the fact that there are 2 different kind of heroes. that there's the kind of hero that does something, and there's the kind of hero that does nothing. And let me explain that for a second, that there's a kind of hero that advances the banner forward, and there is another hero that simply stands their ground. That there is one type of hero that accomplishes great things, and there is another type of hero that endures great circumstances. For example, in 1973 at Clark Air Force Base, 143 brave men stumbled out of an airplane. Some of them were crippled and bent. All of them were POWs from the Vietnam War. The oldest and the highest ranking official out of all of them was Navy Captain Jeremiah Denton, who all of a sudden walked up to a microphone just like this one in order to talk to the friends and the family of the people who were there. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. What would you say to the friends and the family of your men that had been captured and tortured in a Vietnamese prison camp for almost 8 years? What would you say to your own friends and family members in a situation like that? Let me tell you what Jeremiah Denton said. He said this, that we are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. That we are profoundly grateful to our commander-in-chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America. And then he and the rest of those 143 men fell into the arms of their waiting families. I'm about to make a statement that I think you know me. It is not a partisan statement by any stretch of the imagination. No matter who is the president of the United States, whether it be Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, or President Trump, what you will know about me is that I will always support our president, because who am I to replace what God has put in place? However, with that being said, one quick thing that I want to say is that during the campaign trail, you might have heard this, that then President candidate Trump was going back and forth with Senator John McCain, and President Trump had made this comment saying, well, I mean, Senator McCain, why is he a hero when he didn't even do anything? I mean, he was just stuck in a prison camp. It's not like he killed anybody. It's not like he advanced the banner forward. And you and I might take issue with that statement because there's something about the character of a person who suffers well. There's something about the character of a person who can suffer with dignity and someone who can suffer with honor. You know why? Because most of us are considered insufferable when we suffer. You know what I'm saying? Like you get a little man cold. You're like moaning and groaning all day long, ringing your bell all day long, wondering why your toddler hasn't brought you your ginger ale yet. You know, most of us are considered pretty insufferable when we suffer. And yet, this is what we know. When you suffer poorly, yes, you're considered unfortunate. When you suffer poorly, then yes, you are considered a poor baby. However, the point that I'm trying to make today is that not only when you suffer, but when you suffer well, here's the point that I'm trying to make, that you're actually considered a hero. Let me tell you about somebody who I think is a hero in our church. Here's his picture right here. His name is Matt Olson. If you don't know who Matt Olson is, then your life would be better if you knew who Matt Olson is, because Matt Olson right now is suffering from cancer. He has Hodgkin's lymphoma, and still at the same time, he was still here this morning at 6 o'clock in the morning helping our church set up. And just this past week, Matt Olson was going through his second chemo treatment, and he doesn't simply walk into the hospital. He will bust into the hospital like he owns the place. You know, like he will go in for his chemotherapy treatment, and he will just ooze positivity. In fact, he will force all of the hospital staff to do CrossFit exercises with him as he goes through chemotherapy. And what you will find about Matt Olson is that he refuses to be defined by his condition. He would rather be defined by his courage. See, there are a lot of people in our church who have even lost children. The most unfortunate of circumstances, right? That is a circumstance that you and I can't even imagine. However, at the same time, these people have mourned the loss of their children. They have suffered the flexing without the failure of their faith. And at the same time, what you will find is that not only are they unfortunate, but that these people, when they come out on the other side, they are heroes. They refuse to be defined by their condition. They want to be defined by their courage. And so over the course of the next 14 weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the life of somebody who embodied this heroism that we're talking about, and that is a man named Job. Today, if you'll allow me to do this, today is a little bit more, it's going to be kind of a different sermon, because today what we're going to be doing is, instead of zeroing in on one aspect of Job's life, what we're going to attempt to do today is we're going to attempt to get a little bit more of an overview of the book of Job. What you will find is that the book of Job is not only one of the best books in the Bible. What you will find is that the book of Job is one of the oldest, one of the finest pieces of literature in the history of the world, dating back all the way to the days of Genesis. You know what I'm saying? Like, in the beginning. Like, all the way back to the book of Genesis. Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, described the book of Job in 3 words: magnificent and sublime. Victor Hugo, the French author who wrote the book Les Miserables, said that the book of Job is perhaps the greatest masterpiece of the human mind. Whoa. It's like the greatest masterpiece of the human mind. And what you will find about the book of Job is that part of the reason why it is one of the greatest masterpieces of the human mind is not simply because Job suffered, and not simply to the extent that Job suffered, but also because of the fact that Job suffered in many of the ways that you and I suffer. So Job, what we will find about Job is that his suffering, in some way, stretch of the imagination, it is relatable to us. Do you know why? Because he suffers in key areas that you and I suffer in, areas of our health, areas of our family, areas of our wealth and our worldly possessions. As he suffers, what you will find is that you and I can relate with him, not simply because, he's not Mr. Super Christian that goes, you know what, God's going to bring something great out of this, and I can't wait to see what the kind of story that God's going to write. Job doesn't do that. You know what Job does? Job pours out his complaint, and he pours out his heart before God for 37 or 39 chapters of the Bible, as he cannot understand why it is that this thing is happening to him. And perhaps what is most confusing and most disturbing about the book of Job is the fact that the book of Job teaches us that it is not only the guilty that suffer. That in other words, that bad things don't only happen to bad people, because that's the world that you and I want to live in. You and I want to live in a world where only bad things happen to bad people, right? I mean, as children, we know that if we disobey our parents, right, that actions have consequences. That if you do something bad, you're going to get a spank, you get in the naughty chair, something like that. Bad things, one of the lessons I want to teach my children is that bad things happen to bad children. We understand that if we speed all the time and if we drive like a crazy maniac, that at some point we're going to get a speeding ticket. We understand that if we eat cheeseburgers every day of our lives, that at some point we're going to have a heart condition. We would understand it. Maybe I don't know, maybe you wouldn't like it, but we would understand it if there was like this twister that went around and only targeted the homes of registered sex offenders, like then we would know that maybe there's some sort of cosmic justice in the world that we live in. And yet what you find is this, that the older you get, the more you seem to understand that there seems to be absolutely no correlation between the amount of stupid things that you do and the amount of pain that we experience in this life. That in other words, that bad things don't only happen to bad people, the bad things actually happen to good people. And that sometimes that the more good you do, sometimes the more you end up getting knocked down. If you know Matt Olson, then you end up thinking to yourself, how on earth can Hodgkin's lymphoma end up attacking someone like that? You know, you have someone in your life where you think to yourself, God, how could you have allowed that to happen to that person? And you know what? If you've ever thought that about that person, then you're definitely going to think that about Job. Because what we're going to find is this, that Job endured the worst of circumstances, the worst of circumstances. We're going to talk about that in coming days. Endured the worst of circumstances. And you know what? We're also going to talk about this next week. But you know what the Bible calls him? The Bible calls him blameless. The Bible calls him blameless. Now, it's one thing for your buddy who's been divorced 5 times to come up to you and be like, dude, those marriage problems, that's not your fault. That's on her. It's one thing for your buddy to say that you are without blame. It's another thing for the Bible to write the story of your life and to call you blameless, right? That's what I would want the Bible to say about my life. I don't know if it actually would. The Bible not only calls him blameless. So in other words, here's what we know about Job, that not only is he one of the godliest men of his time, we also know this, that he is one of the richest, the most affluent men of his time. What we also know about him, and we're going to discover this in coming days, is that he is a fantastic father. He is an amazing husband. And yet, because of absolutely no fault of his own, because remember the Bible just said that he's blameless, because of no fault of his own, you know what? Everything is about to get taken away from him. That he is about to go from, you know, most affluent man in the world to homeless man. You know what I'm saying? Like Bill Gates, all of a sudden you're riding your bike along the Santa Ana River encampment, and you're like, Bill Gates? Is that you? Why are you a homeless man? Like that's Job's situation. Not only does he lose everything, he loses everyone, with exclusion of his wife, and he's going to wish God had taken her too in a little bit. Because in the midst of all of that tragedy, in that one very sensitive and very raw moment, she's going to end up turning to Job and saying that I want you to curse God and die. So I was going to entitle this message, I can't eat by day, can't sleep by night, the woman that I got won't treat me right. Because that is pretty much Job's life in 20 words or less, and yet in the middle of losing everything, you know what I'm saying? I'm not just talking about getting swindled out of your retirement, because if that ever happened, we would become very, very bitter people. We're talking about somebody who lost everything. Someone who didn't just lose one child, someone who lost 10 children. And in the midst of all of that, he says this in Job chapter 1, verse 21, blessed be the name of the Lord. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh. Easy come, easy go. Is that how open-handed you are with your money? Is that how open-handed you are with your family, with your children? The Lord gives, the Lord takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If that isn't bad enough, round 2 gets even worse. Because God is now about to strike at his physical condition. So where we find Job at this point is that he is sitting on top of a trash heap, Bill Gates himself, covered in blisters that erupt into pus. He's got a fever that's like a hard habit to break. and he's got an itch that won't be solved by a gallon of cortisone. And it's at that point that 4 friends come and comfort him. Have you ever been to a hospital room and seen somebody in such a horrific condition that you didn't know what to say? Have you ever had somebody call you up and explain the details of their situation, and it was so horrific that you didn't know what to say? I mean, that is Job's friends, because they sit there in silence with their friend for 7 days, not knowing what to say. Now, it just so ends up that that is the best thing that they could have ever done. You know why? Because we as men, the moment we open our mouths, that's when we end up getting ourselves into trouble. And that's what happens with Job's friends, because the moment Job's friends end up speaking, 37, 39 chapters, I forget, here's a synthesis of everything that they end up trying to communicate to Job, and that is this right here in Job chapter 36, verse 17. Everything that they say can be boiled down to one verse, but now you are being punished as you deserve. The Bible calls him blameless. Only thing his friends can do is say, you know what, this is all your fault. And what we know is this, that during trial and tragedy, whether it's your fault or whether it's not, one of the things that we all struggle with is, you know what, this has got to be my fault. We deal with the burden and the pressure of thinking like, well, there's something I could have done to have avoided this. And imagine in the middle of all of that trial and tragedy, your friend coming to you and saying, you know why you were raped? Because you dress like that. You know why you got cancer? Because you don't take your vitamins. Because you don't eat well. You know why you got hit by a truck? Because you weren't running on the sidewalk. The guy was DUI at 9 o'clock in the morning, people. I could have been running in the middle of the street. Or I could have been running like way off on the sidewalk. He still would have hit me. And yet, why did someone amen when he said he would have still hit me? I got some enemies in this church. Got some enemies. That's okay. I'm used to it. I feel like this is, you know, we all, as Christians, we all have answers. And sometimes answers aren't the right thing. We all want answers in that situation, but sometimes answers aren't really what we need in that moment. And that's what I feel like. That's part of the reason why I feel like we as Christians need to talk about the book of Job. Because what you're going to find is that grief and sorrow are more universal emotions than even joy and gladness. And a lot of times, because we as Christians are so happy and shiny and so faith-filled and all of these things, we find ourselves in the midst of tragedy so ill-prepared and so under-equipped to handle many times the more tragic side of life. I picked up a book. It's probably the best book I've ever read on grief, tragedy, overcoming it, all of those different things. It's called Option B. If you pick it up and there are a couple swear words in it, I don't remember them, so I'm not like officially endorsing this book. However, it's a book by a woman named Sheryl Sandberg, who's the chief operating officer of Facebook, and she talks about how it is that she dealt with the sudden loss of her husband. So, for example, she went off to Mexico with a bunch of friends to celebrate a friend's 50th birthday, and she took a nap. She woke up. Her husband was not there. She went for a swim. She came back to the hotel. Her husband was not there. She went to dinner. All of her friends were gathered. Her husband still was not there. So they all began to try and retrace where it is that her husband could have been. So they all go to the gym. They find him dead on the floor, lying next to the elliptical machine. And after the ambulance comes and after the doctor pronounces him dead, this is what she writes. She says, "Someone asked if I wanted to see Dave to say goodbye. And I did. I didn't want to leave. I thought that if I just stayed in that room and held him, that if I refused to let go, I'd end up waking up from this nightmare. And when his brother Rob, in shock himself, said that we had to go, I took a few steps out of the room, then turned around and ran back in, hugging Dave as hard as I could. Eventually, Rob lovingly pulled me off of Dave's body. Marnie walked me down the long, wide hall, her arms around my waist, holding me up and preventing me from running back into that room. And so began the rest of my life. It was and still is a life I would have never chosen, a life I was completely unprepared for. The unimaginable. Sitting down with my son and daughter and telling them that their father had died. Hearing their screams joined by my own. The funeral. Speeches where people spoke of Dave in the past tense. My house filling up with familiar faces coming up to me again and again, delivering the perfunctory kiss on the cheek, followed by those same words, "I'm sorry for your loss." When we arrived at the cemetery, my children got out of the car and fell to the ground, unable to take another step. And I lay on the grass, holding them as they walked. Their cousins came, lay down with us all. And we all piled up in a big sobbing heap with adult arms, trying in vain to protect them from their sorrow. Poetry, philosophy, and physics all teach us that we don't experience time in equal increments, and time slowed way down, because this is what we realize, that grief can be a very demanding companion. If you have not experienced that level of tragedy, guess what? That level of tragedy is coming for us. And what I'm trying to say is that life doesn't always hand us a bouquet of roses, does it? We don't always experience the joy of the Lord. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as Christians is, how do we overcome that? How do we move through it? And how do we even get to a place where we can help other people see God in the midst of all of that? And help other people move through that as well, because that's part of the reason why we exist as a church, right? That we want to be able to comfort those who are in need. That we want to be able to approach the lost, the let down, and looking and help them become living proof of a loving God. And part of that is being able to meet them right in the middle of their stuff and point them to God. That is part of the reason why we're building this building. That's part of the reason why we do church. That's part of the reason why we have our children's ministry, our student ministries. That's part of the reason why I'm speaking at our prison ministries graduation on Tuesday night. But I also have a little announcement to make, and that's also part of the reason why in the fall we are starting our 4th service. Now let me tell you why we're not starting our 4th service. We are not starting our 4th service because I really want to come back on a Sunday night after having already preached 3 Sunday morning services. We are not having another service because we're not busy enough as it is as a church. Part of the reason why we're having this service is because, honestly, hell's too hot and time's too short, everybody. That in our key services, 9, 15, and 11, we're pretty much at capacity. We have no room in the auditorium. We're about at 80% capacity, 80% full is full. And so there are also a different demographic of people that just don't go to church on a Sunday morning because they have sports, because they have to work, whatever the case may be. And we as a church want to be able to reach those people by having a Sunday night service. So here's what we're asking. We're not asking this of all of you guys, but we're asking 100 Green Berets in our church to consider moving off of Sunday morning in order to help us plant essentially another church. It's here, but to essentially plant another church Sunday nights. Now, let me tell you what's going to be awesome. This is going to happen in the fall, but let me tell you what's going to be awesome about it. Yeah, we're going to have food available so that you don't have to worry about cooking. You can just buy a meal at a reasonable price. so you don't have to worry about cooking and cleaning. Yes, we're going to make it so that there's just going to be a little bit more worship during that time because it's a night service and we're going to be able to settle in for a little bit more. The children's things are going to be awesome. But really, the reason why we're inviting you to do this is to join us in helping us make the Inland Empire the hardest place to go to hell. Because let me tell you, this is going to be the easiest ask that I make of you. Because in a little bit, let me tell you the asks that I'm going to make of us as a church as well. In a little bit, I'm going to ask some of you to leave the Eastvale campus in order to plant a campus of VantagePoint Church in your own city so that we can help reach your friends and your neighbors more effectively for Jesus Christ. In a little bit, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask some of you to leave this country in order for some of you to become long-term missionaries in inland China so that you might be able to take the gospel to a group of people who have never, ever heard the name of Jesus Christ before. And today, I'm not asking you to leave our city, nor am I asking you to leave our country. Today, I'm just asking you, if you would hear, if you do, I'm not saying that the voice of God will talk to you to leave Sunday morning, because I don't want all of you to show up on Sunday night. If the voice of God would be talking to you saying, you know what, maybe you can be here on Sunday night because your kids have activities too, and or maybe you don't have kids and you have a little bit more flexibility. If that's you today, we're not even asking for commitment today. This is the first time we've ever even talked about it. It's hard to make a commitment with the first time you've ever heard something. And so we need 100 people, though. We need 100 people who are willing to serve. We need 100 people who are willing to sit in that service and attend, and we really can't do it without you, okay? So why don't you bow your heads?